Welcome back to Talking Europe. If you're just joining us, we're bringing you a special edition of the programme from the European Development Days in Brussels. Sometimes called the Davos of Development, the event is held annually and it attracts high-profile participants from across the globe. This year's theme is Women and Girls at the Forefront of Sustainable Development. I'm very pleased to welcome two guests exceptionally for this interview. Firstly, Phumzile Lambo-Ngcuka, Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of UN Women. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Also very pleased to welcome the EU Commissioner in charge of International Cooperation and Development, Mr. Neven Mimica. Hello to you too.
Hello.
So the reason you're both here is because the UN and the European Union have teamed up on the Spotlight initiative. Just give us an idea of what this is and why you've decided to work together. Madam, first.
Well, thanks very much to the EU for having chosen to work with the United Nations to address the issue of violence against women, which is a big challenge for the world. 1 out of 3 women lives with some form of violence, and the program is about addressing violence in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and in the Caribbean. And in each region, we focus on a particular type of violence. In Asia, it's about trafficking. In Africa, it's about cultural practices that are harmful to women, such as female genital mutilation and child marriage. In Latin America, it's femicide. And in the Caribbean, it is domestic violence. All of these are big issues that impact on women all over the world.
So, Commissioner, what's the European involvement in this then?
Actually, with the new Sustainable Development Goals agenda as of 2015, we started to contemplate what the European Union impact on the implementation of this new agenda could be. And because we are the biggest global provider of official development assistance, we have a special responsibility and special solidarity to prove under this agenda. And we looked into each and every of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we found a woman in each of these 17 goals. We realized that women, girls, that they are driving forces of reaching each and every goal. It's a cross-cutting power that is still under pressure, that is still hampered, and we therefore decided to do something more, to do more in a more systematic way, because we used to work together with the UN Women, with UN agencies before on gender-related issues. But now we decided to launch a big global movement, I would say. 500 million euros is the seed money for financing this, but it's more than a money. It's a joint action that should make it clear to each and every person, men and women. This is important fact.
We'll come to the funding in a minute, but I'm just wondering, for both of you, are you expecting much resistance to this? Because even in Europe, we've seen resistance to certain efforts to achieve gender equality, and I would imagine the problem is even bigger in other parts of the world, particularly these cultural arguments that one sometimes hears deployed about we have our own culture, the UN, the EU, whoever you are, these outsiders should not intervene. How are you planning to deal with that?
Well, there's just as much energy to do something, in fact, more energy to do something than there is resistance. The majority of the people in those countries want these changes that we are advocating to actually happen. And we are not alone. The UN, even though it comes with UNFPA, UNICEF, ILO and UNDP, but we also have civil society who are part of those community. We are mobilizing religious community. We are organizing cultural leaders. So it is not just the UN and the EU getting into a community cold just by ourselves. We actually come as a package of different stakeholders, very much with the people that come from the communities that we plan to work in.
What about the money then? Because you mentioned this figure of 500 million euros. Has that just been pledged, or has any of it actually been spent yet?
Oh. In this case, on that occasion, we really managed to assemble formally from various European budget sources and to put it to the trust fund in the United Nations. And we organized all institutional setup that should enable us to have concrete, efficient programs, projects to start with them, and we are already doing so for some of the regions. The projects are already launched. By the end of summer, we shall have another for Latin America. So it's going. It's a real money and real programs already.
So in terms of the actual partners, I mean, you mentioned civil society, for example. What about the private sector? Because I've heard here some people saying that the private sector is sometimes quicker to identify the benefits of long-term investment in things like literacy for women or girls than national authorities or governments. So how do you get that balance right between the different kinds of donors?
Private sector is a targeted partner as well, hoping they will come with their own money, of course, but we actually need them because also violence against women, as you know, also takes place at the workplace. The same woman who lives with domestic violence at home can be the same woman who's being harassed also at home. We know from Me Too that harassment at the workplace is also highly prevalent. So we want leaders, whether they're in the private sector, in the public, to speak with one voice on this issue so that perpetrators can actually see that there is no place to hide, whether at work or at home or in the public sector or in the private sector. The message is one. We have to create an ecosystem that is mutually reinforcing on these messages.
So the badge that you're wearing, I presume that refers to this ecosystem, She is We, which is a hashtag
She's
one
everybody.
has seen. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we have a saying in South Africa, Ubuntu, I am because you are. Which means that we are all in this thing together. My humanity is valid because I also recognize humanity in you. It goes both ways.
What do you think, as I've got someone who's obviously, you were very high level in South Africa, a former vice president of South Africa. You were a member of the South African Parliament as well. What do you think, if anything, Europe and Africa can learn from each other in terms of representation of women in politics, I suppose, as that's probably your first-hand experience?
Actually, if we can learn more in Europe, and we can definitely, then it should be with and from our African partners, because we are so much close to each other, we are so much interconnected that all the experiences coming from Africa, all the initiatives, all the enthusiasm coming from Africa should be reflected in our development projects, in our economic, social programs, because I see that it's only 14 kilometers of the Gibraltar Strait that divides, that separate Africa and Europe, and all other things should unite us, should bring us together. In that respect, yes, the knowledge, the experience, the good practice coming from, for instance, from South Africa, from your engagement at home in South Africa, but also now at the United Nations, is very, very important guiding.
There's some interesting facts, aren't there, that women are better represented in some African parliaments, for example, Rwanda, than in European countries.
Somalia is 30% women in parliament. Which is quite an achievement for a country like Somalia, for instance. Sudan, I mean, Senegal, of course, South Africa. So that doesn't, at the same time, tell the full story.
No,
because you need women to be there, but you also need the women to be effective. So you have to continuously support the women also to play the role. One of the limitations that many African parliaments have got is the allocation of resources for initiatives that benefit women. So together with the EU and with many African countries, we're also working for gender-responsive budgeting in order to make sure that even when a country has limited resources, it still has a treasury. In that treasury, you must allocate the resources in a manner that supports women. One of the countries that is doing that in an encouraging way, for instance, is Uganda. With its limited budget, it is able to have significant impact because of gender-responsive budgeting. We're seeing that in Morocco happening. So each country, even if it is not a rich country, can generate best practice that we can share.
What about in Europe, Commissioner Mimic? So where are the problem areas that you see, the most pressing problems or countries?
Yeah, when it comes to gender equality, gender empowerment, there is still a lot of work to be done in Europe as well. Indeed, I see that violence against women and girls in Europe is not much less than in Africa or in Latin America, Caribbean. So even this average of 1 woman out of 3 experienced violence during her lifetime. I think it's quite similar in Europe, and this was one of the reasons why I personally was so much engaged into moving this Spotlight initiative forward, because I realized that among 3 of my female colleagues, friends, family members, one of them might be really affected and terrified by the violence. So it was really something that we have to work on in Europe, but also in our external actions. It's also about empowering women in Europe. It's about the pay gap. It's about some kind of ceiling in the labor, in the management structures. So it's much more than violence in Europe that we have to address as well.
Just on a final point, if I could ask your reaction about when you see the picture in Europe, the return of some populist forces saying we don't want to implement gender equality because it's the thin end of the wedge, it's going to lead to same-sex marriages, undermining the traditional family, all this kinds of things. Is there any effective message against that when you see what's happening in Europe today?
Well, we really have to mobilize and organize a movement of both men and women that can counter those forces, because for that narrative, there is also a counter-narrative. And you can put in all of the issues that impact on women in almost all the countries. All countries have issue of violence against women. All countries have underrepresentation of women in decision-making bodies. All countries have got unpaid care work as a burden that limits women's participation in the economy. In all countries, women are also the people that have less economic well-being. If you put all of these things together, for which there's a solution, you actually have a global challenge that affects women in each and every country. All countries have unequal pay. So we are saying between now and 2030, these are some of the really concrete, changeable circumstances that if we consolidate on the movement for gender equality of both men and women, we can actually reach 2030 with substantive equality, having touched on all of these issues. And the laws, by the way, the fact that there are about 150 countries still that have laws that discriminate against women. So add the laws and the norms, we can move this. All of what I've mentioned is not rocket science. You and I can do it.
Well, thank you so much for that. And now it's time for our Fact or Fake segment, which is brought to you by our partner, Toute l'Europe, and this is actually very relevant to our discussion because it's about disinformation and myths surrounding the Istanbul Convention on violence against women and domestic violence. Let's take a look.
The Istanbul Convention paves the way for same-sex marriage, so claims Volen Nikolov Siderov, current leader of the Bulgarian far-right party Ataka, in a message published on Facebook on the 28th of January. A statement spread by many ultra-conservative sites across Europe. 10 European Union member states, including Bulgaria and Slovakia, have refused to ratify this Council of Europe Convention against Violence Against Women. They say that this international treaty would introduce a hidden legalization of same-sex marriage and refer to controversial gender theories. Actually, the text does not mention LGBT rights or a third sex. The Istanbul Convention is the first legally binding instrument at European level, providing a legal framework to protect women and girls from all forms of violence. It deals with forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and sexual harassment. This has nothing to do with the issue of homosexuality or gender, which have provoked the ire of conservative circles and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Some observers believe that this misinterpretation is due to a poor translation of the word gender into Bulgarian. For others, it will be a way of dismissing a text that would call into question the place of women in society. This refusal to ratify the treaty, justified by biased interpretations, run the risk of cancelling a text that is nevertheless useful in the European Union. According to the European Fundamental Rights Agency, 1 in 5 female Europeans is a victim of physical and/or sexual violence.
Thank you so much to my guest, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, Director of UN Women and EU Commissioner, Neven Mimica. That's all for this edition of Talking Europe. Thanks for watching.
I'm Jessica Le Mazurier. I am France 24's New York and United Nations correspondent. You can find my live coverage and reports on France 24's news programmes and on France24.com.
Jessica Le Mazurier, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.